Is natural rights theory trying to bridge the is-ought gap? Is it religious? David Hume argued that you can't derive moral conclusions, what one ought to do, purely from empirical facts, what is. So when libertarians say humans are rational and self-owning, therefore they have rights, some critics accuse us of making the leap from fact to value. But this is a misreading of how natural law theory actually functions in libertarian thought. We're not saying that merely because humans are a certain way, we can automatically deduce a moral system. Instead, we're saying this: if you want a legal system that is principled, consistent, and universally applicable, then it must be based on the nature of individual human beings as rational acting agents. This makes natural law a hypothetical imperative, not a categorical one. We're not saying you must accept natural rights. We're saying it is a requirement of justice to have laws applied to all people without contradiction. Natural rights, rooted in self-ownership and the non-aggression principle, are the only consistent foundation. Human nature is the anchor here, not in a mystical or religious sense, but in the very real sense the Austrian tradition emphasized, that humans individually are the actors. They choose, plan, and exchange. Libertarian natural rights theory, especially as developed by Rothbard, is a form of rational ethics. It says, if you're going to engage in moral reasoning at all, if you're going to claim that violence is wrong, then you must apply that principle consistently. Hence, the non-aggression principle. Natural rights theory is not making an is-to-ought leap, as it would be fallacious. For example, saying humans are aggressive, therefore war is good, is an is-to-ought reasoning, and it's invalid. What natural rights theory actually says is, if you believe laws ought to be universal and that ethical claims must apply equally to all people, then you must reject coercion and embrace self-ownership. It's an ought-to-ought argument. If you accept this moral standard, then here is what logically follows. So why call it natural? Because it's grounded in what is characteristically human, our individual capacity for reasoning, planning, and voluntary action. We're not saying nature commands rights. We're saying rights are the logical framework for justice given the kinds of beings we are. Natural doesn't mean dictated by nature, it means derived from the nature of human beings in the moral context of peaceful coexistence. Is that religious? Not in the slightest. There's no appeal to supernatural authority. The idea that rights are grounded in our nature as rational beings is a classical liberal idea stemming from Aristotle, Aquinas, and Locke, but Rothbard and others removed the theological baggage and placed it on secular, objective grounds. And law isn't religion, it's nothing more than the method by which we resolve conflict. So the essential question becomes, what principle should law be grounded in if we want it to be just? Other legal systems, especially state legislation, fail this test. They are arbitrary, they are coercive, they do not apply universally. They privilege some over others, initiate violence, and override consent. They are simply domination masquerading as order. By rejecting natural rights, you're rejecting the very idea of principled law. You're left with power, not ethics. You may have heard people talk about positive rights or positive freedom, but these are misleading terms. I believe they are meant to be purposely deceptive. They aren't really rights, and they don't describe freedom in any meaningful sense. What they do is describe government-created entitlements. You saw this clearly during COVID when so-called rights were redefined to mean government intrusion, while actual liberties like the right to worship or open your business or leave your home were suspended overnight. The state claimed to be protecting a right to safety and a right to public health while trampling genuine freedoms. Even worse, modern liberals began insisting on things like a right to feel safe in your community, a vague and subjective notion that turns personal discomfort into a basis for censorship, surveillance, and coercion. If your feelings are a right, then my liberty becomes a threat. A true right, sometimes called a negative right, is simply a right to be left alone, the right to not be hurt, robbed, or defrauded. These rights require only that others refrain from initiating force against you. They impose no obligations on others except non-aggression. That means they apply to all people equally, and they cannot be overridden by the arbitrary will of a ruler or a majority. If a supposed right can be suspended or revoked by the state, then it isn't a right at all. It's a privilege granted and withdrawn at the discretion of power. A supposed right to receive a good or service, healthcare, housing, education, a job, these are claims on other people's labor and other people's property. And that's the problem. Positive rights always violate negative rights. If I have a right to healthcare, then someone, either a doctor or a taxpayer, must be compelled to provide it or fund it. That is coercion, plain and simple. It violates the doctor's self-ownership and the taxpayer's property rights. So, what are positive rights really? They are entitlements enforced through aggression. You'll sometimes hear people say human rights instead of positive rights, as if the label itself settles the debate. But most of these so called human rights come from international bodies like the United Nations, whose declarations include entitlements. Likewise, charter rights in places like Canada or the EU are not natural or inviolable. They are rights granted by the state and therefore revocable by the state. They are not universal and they are explicitly limited. Many come with built in clauses allowing for reasonable limits prescribed by law. But a right with a clause is not a right, it's a permission slip. They invert the concept of rights by turning one's personal need into another person's obligation under threat of state violence. What about procedural rights? They are entitlements, right? But they aren't bad, are they? Like the right to a fair trial, due process, legal counsel, or a jury of your peers. These are often held up as essential to justice. Yes, that's true, but many of them, in fact, stem from the older traditions like common law, which evolved organically to reflect basic principles of natural justice. In a truly free society where law emerges from voluntary institutions and peaceful arbitration, such procedures would still exist, but they wouldn't be granted from above. They'd arise as logical outgrowths of natural justice itself. Take the right to legal counsel. Under a state, it's an entitlement, a defensive measure to shield individuals from the overwhelming power of state prosecution. But without the state, such an entitlement would be unnecessary. It's not fundamental, it's a safeguard against a fundamentally coercive institution. By contrast, mechanisms like voting aren't rights at all. They're political rituals used to legitimize the coercion of some over others. The fact that voting is an entitlement is no problem. It's not needed for a just society. In the end, the state cannot be trusted to define or protect rights, and we don't need entitlements to have justice. In a free society, no one is entitled to another person's life, labor, or property. That's the essence of liberty. True rights create peaceful boundaries between people. False rights destroy those boundaries in the name of redistribution. There is no such thing as a positive right.